You think you can sleep with me and disappear, Amelia Hart. The moment the Mafia boss spoke, my body went cold. Dante Moretti, the Italian Mafia king the underworld calls the devil in a suit. And me, the woman who left a note on his nightstand. Thanks for last night. Don't look for me. Now I'm standing in front of him in the boardroom of the very company he owns. I knew you before that night, he says slowly. You walked into my club because I allowed it. And now you belong to me. Everything inside me shatters. That one night I thought was an accident, was a trap carefully laid by the devil himself. I am Amelia Hart, and I've just become the prey of a man no one dares to refuse. I know this might feel heavy right from the jump, but that's how life hits you sometimes, isn't it? It just comes at you full force without a warning sign. Before we dive into the deep end of this, and trust me, it gets messy, I'd really appreciate it if you took just 2 seconds to stop and connect with me. If you're watching this, if you're listening to my voice right now, please just open your phone, hit that like button so I know you're here, and leave a comment below telling me your first impression. Subscribe to the channel too if you haven't already. It's what keeps me going, walking through these hard memories, knowing I'm walking through them with you. Thank you. Now let's get back to the room because honestly, I couldn't breathe. The conference room was all polished, dark wood and glass, the kind of room where decisions that break or build cities are made. It was 3 days after I'd slipped out of his penthouse before the sun even hit the skyline, feeling like I'd just stolen a week's worth of freedom in one reckless night. I'd walked into the Moretti Group headquarters thinking I was finally going to get the interior design contract that would lift me and my sister Evelyn out of the constant financial scrape we'd been living in since I left my ex. When I saw the massive building, all cold steel and impossible height, I felt that tiny thrilling surge of hope, a desperate little prayer that maybe this was the break I'd earned after years of scraping by. That hope died the second the man at the head of the impossibly long table lifted his eyes from a file and looked straight at me, his gaze hitting me with the force of a physical blow. I was wearing my best, slightly too tight black blazer, the one that made me feel professional, like I belonged, and I could feel the thin fabric clinging to my back as the blood drained from my face, leaving me feeling dizzy, small, and exposed in a way that recalled the worst moments of my past life where control was always the currency, and I had none. He didn't move much, Dante. It wasn't a big dramatic reveal, no sudden theatrical stand-up that might betray an eagerness to claim me. He just leaned back maybe an inch in his leather chair, a tiny, almost imperceptible shift in posture that managed to convey an entire universe of power and recognition, like a king acknowledging a lost minor subject. It was that slow, deliberate look, the way his dark eyes swept over me, analyzing every detail from the cheap heels I'd spent half a paycheck on, and which were already pinching my toes, to the sudden, uncontrollable flush creeping up my neck, a betrayal of my carefully constructed professional facade. I remember trying to swallow, realizing my throat was bone dry, and my hand instinctively went to the strap of my oversized portfolio bag, clutching the worn leather until my knuckles turned white, finding a momentary comfort in the familiar texture of my working life. The other people in the room, 2 grim-faced executives and a sleek legal consultant, all stopped talking, frozen mid-sentence, waiting for a cue. They were all dressed in expensive gray suits, looking like polished stones, utterly lacking in human warmth. But their attention was focused entirely on him, and now terrifyingly on me, because he had shifted his focus to the only person in the room who wasn't part of their expensive, deadly club. I tried to use that quiet strength I always kept tucked away, the one that got me through all the awful, dismissive moments in life, the strength that taught me not to flinch when things got ugly. I attempted to speak, to offer some professional greeting. "Good morning, Mr. Moretti," or something equally hollow, that would magically rewind the past 3 days, that would re-establish the boundaries of business. But the sound caught, turning into this pathetic little rasp, a humiliating failure to execute even the simplest social formality. Dante just watched me, his expression fixed, a small, utterly humorless smile, touching the corner of his mouth, a gesture that was more of a tightening of the lips than a genuine expression of mirth. It was the smile of a predator who had spent ample time playing with his food before the inevitable end, enjoying the psychological anticipation of the collapse. He didn't even use my name again after his initial chilling question. He didn't need to. The silence in that room, the sheer crushing weight of his presence was the only identification necessary, sealing my fate as his quarry. He signaled the others to leave with a minute dismissive flick of his wrist, a gesture that held more authority than a full shouted command, and they scrambled out their silence, more deafening than any shouting could have been, leaving me alone with the man I'd shared a reckless, desperate night with. As the heavy, soundproof door clicked shut, the formality of the room suddenly felt suffocating and claustrophobic, like being trapped in a glass cage, suspended miles above the city, completely visible yet utterly isolated. He stood up, then finally unfolding his immense height from the chair, and that was a whole other level of terrifying, turning the danger from abstract to physical. Up close last weekend in the dark privacy of his penthouse suite, he was just a stunningly handsome stranger who felt like danger wrapped in silk and cologne. Here in the harsh, high noon light of day in his domain, wearing a suit that must have cost more than my car, he was monumental and immovable force. He walked toward me slowly, deliberately, not with haste, but with certainty, his movements echoing the slow, steady rhythm of a ticking clock counting down to 0, and I found myself involuntarily taking a step backward until the edge of the large boardroom table pressed into the small of my back, offering a cold, thin barrier that I knew was meaningless. It wasn't until he reached the table, placing both hands flat on the polished surface, leaning in, slightly looking down the length of it at me, that he broke the silence again, amplifying the tension with every perfectly modulated word. "You left me a note, Amelia." He stated the words perfectly articulated, each syllable dropping like ice into a silent pool, devoid of any warmth or emotion, save for a low, dangerous ownership. A little scribble that said, "Don't look for me." Did you think that was clever? Did you imagine I was some kind of vacation fling you could just erase with a thank you note and a clean exit? I'm not some hedge fund manager you met at a bar, Amelia. I am the man who controls this city's shadows. He paused, his gaze burning right through my blazer, right through my carefully crafted professionalism, right into the core of my vulnerability, recalling the frantic, desperate energy I'd expended trying to flee that morning. I could feel the heat rising in my face again, the memory of that night flooding in, the desperation I'd felt to lose myself, to pretend I was someone strong and carefree if only for a few hours. I'd wanted to feel wanted just once, without consequence, without the crushing weight of reality. And that's precisely what had made me walk into his exclusive dark club that night, feeling completely out of place yet desperately seeking oblivion, in a way that now felt bitterly naive. I finally found my voice pushing back the fear with sheer necessity, drawing on the years of practicing composure under duress. It was a mutual arrangement. I managed my voice, steadying just enough to sound almost firm, but with a slight tremor I knew he could detect. A private moment. It had nothing to do with this contract or this job, and I expect you to maintain a professional distance. My proposal stands on its own merit. I came here on a legitimate business proposal to redesign your offices, and that is where the conversation must end. I actually took a small step forward away from the table, adjusting the lapel of my blazer as a physical act of defiance, trying to prove to both him and myself that I was still in control of anything, even if it was just the illusion of professional boundaries. I could feel the thin lie of my statement crumbling under his intense scrutiny. Professional distance was not in his vocabulary, not with me, not when he looked at me like that with a mixture of possessiveness and cold, hard clarity that suggested he knew exactly how much I was worth and how little I actually had to bargain with. He didn't even argue the point. He simply dismissed my entire protest with a slow, chilling smile and turned back toward his chair, moving with the fluid grace of a man who knows the fight is already won. He picked up a thick file that wasn't there before, a file marked with the Moretti insignia, heavier and far more substantial than my own modest portfolio, and placed it down in front of him. "This," he said, tapping the folder lightly with one long, elegant finger, a gesture that conveyed more ownership than if he had slammed his fist on the table, "is your contract. It's for the complete interior renovation of the entire headquarters building, Phase 1, not just a section. It starts immediately. And since the job is now my personal interest, Amelia, I'll be overseeing every meeting, every detail, and every late night you spend sketching layouts. You thought you could walk away from me. I'm here to tell you, Amelia, that you never even left. You simply transitioned from my bed to my business, and now I own your time, your talent, and your presence. The finality in his tone wasn't a threat that needed to be carried out. It was simply a statement of universal law within his orbit. I stood there swaying slightly, the weight of the realization pressing down on me with suffocating force, the biggest break of my career, the very thing I had been praying for, to keep Evelyn safe and pay for her art school tuition without having to take on another humiliating side job, was now the very thing that had permanently trapped me with a man who felt like a beautiful, inevitable storm. I wanted to scream to rip up the contract and run to collapse the whole expensive dream, but my mind was already doing the calculations. The money, the security, the sheer impossibility of saying no to Dante Moretti, without putting my life and, more importantly, Evelyn's future in jeopardy. My entire body felt heavy and slow, like I was moving through thick water, and all I could do was finally let my hand drop from my portfolio, the sound of the worn leather strap hitting the polished table surface, a tiny defeated echo in the vast, silent room. He watched the surrender in my posture, the sudden slump of my shoulders, the way my carefully constructed reserve finally cracked, and that was enough for him. He pointed to the leather armchair across from him, a gesture of command softened only by the plushness of the seat. "Sit," he commanded, not unkindly, but certainly not gently. "We have work to do and a lifetime of catching up." The next few weeks were a blur of cold steel professionalism on his part and sheer paralyzing anxiety on mine, an agonizing routine that chipped away at my sanity. I tried to focus only on the blueprints, the swatches, the budget, pouring every ounce of my desperation, my training and my quiet ambition into the work, hoping that if I was indispensable enough, if I was excellent enough, he would eventually tire of the game and see me as just a designer, and not a mistake he regretted making. I designed with a meticulous, almost fanatical attention to detail, using the precision of interior architecture as a distraction from the chaos of my personal life. But Dante made that impossible. He'd use the professional environment to deliver these small, possessive jabs that only I would understand. In the middle of an architectural review, with 3 bewildered engineers, he'd suddenly cut them off. Mid-explanation of load-bearing walls, look directly at me and say, "Amelia, your coffee is cold. Raphael, get her a fresh one personally, and make sure it's the espresso blend she likes from the small Italian place on 17th Street. That level of personal, unnecessary detail delivered in front of his staff was not a courtesy. It was a loud, chilling announcement that he knew my habits, my preferences, and my movements outside his building. He publicly declared that I was his personal designer, which was supposed to be an honor. But the way he said it, the slow, possessive drag of the word personal, accompanied by a sharp proprietary glance, made it sound like a brand, a permanent claim staked in public view. The whispers started immediately circulating like dry brush, catching fire in the organization, and then spreading out to the shadowy corners of the city that his name touched. It wasn't professional jealousy. It was something far colder and more dangerous, mixed with a fearful curiosity. The executives, the men who had scurried out of the room that first day, now treated me with a bizarre, shifting mix of deference and contempt, their respect for my title instantly negated by their assumption of my true role. Their eyes flicked constantly, habitually to my left hand, checking for a ring, then to my clothes, judging their quality against the backdrop of the opulence surrounding me, finding me wanting. The rumor wasn't that I was a brilliant, self-made designer. It was that I was the boss's new mistress. A cheap indulgence he'd picked up and draped in velvet, a temporary plaything. I felt the weight of their judgment every time I walked into a room, every time the glass elevator doors opened to reveal a new layer of his empire, like a heavy coat I couldn't shed, making my success feel utterly hollow and conditional. This constant, quiet scrutiny felt almost worse than the outright fear of Dante himself, because it was the sound of the world dismissing me yet again, seeing my worth only through the lens of a powerful man. The emotional toll of this public branding reached its peak one evening, when I tried yet again to escape. It was stupid, desperate, and predictable, I know. I was working late on the lighting plans for the executive lounge, trying to finalize the details of a complex lighting grid I'd spent weeks designing, and the vast office was eerily silent except for the faint hum of the server room and the distant sound of traffic. The tension had been building for 2 weeks, this horrible mounting feeling of being watched and owned, and I finally just snapped the control I usually exercised over myself, failing completely. I grabbed my bag, left the files scattered on the table, a completely unprofessional, rebellious thing to do, and bolted for the elevator, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a desperate animalistic urge for freedom overriding all caution. I remember pressing the G button for the ground floor over and over again, willing the ancient machine to move faster, the doors seeming to take an eternity to close, desperate for the cool relief of the city street, and the anonymity it promised, even if only for a few blocks, a few minutes of feeling like Amelia Hart again, not Dante's possession. I made it out onto the sidewalk, inhaling a huge, shaky breath of the humid night air, feeling the sudden dizzying sense of space around me, and started walking fast, not even sure where I was going, just needing distance, needing to feel the pavement under my feet. I took 2 sharp left turns, ducking into a service alley that smelled of stale exhaust and spilled coffee grounds, thinking I'd lose myself in the grid of the financial district's back streets, where no one would look twice at a woman in a blazer running in the dark. That's when the sleek black sedan pulled up silently beside me, the engine a low, quiet purr that was somehow worse than a loud roar, because it was controlled waiting. The back window slid down with a nearly soundless whir, and there was Rafael Costa, Dante's right-hand man, the one who looked like a shadow made solid, staring at me with an expression that was completely unreadable, neither angry nor sympathetic. He wasn't aggressive. He didn't even get out of the car. He was just there, a silent, implacable barrier to my freedom. "Amelia," Rafael said, his voice quiet, devoid of accusation, simply stating a fact. "The boss asked me to ensure you have a ride home. He also asked me to remind you that your sister Evelyn has an early class tomorrow, an important one on Renaissance sketching, and the subway might be running slowly tonight. You wouldn't want her walking alone at this hour, would you? The art district isn't always safe after midnight." The mention of Evelyn, the sudden casual knowledge of her specific schedule, her vulnerable location, and her current academic pursuits, hit me like a physical blow, instantly freezing the fight in my lungs. I stopped dead in my tracks, my shoulders tensing, the adrenaline of my attempted flight instantly replaced by a cold dread that rooted me to the spot. It wasn't a threat, not with any vocal inflection, but the context was everything, and I knew exactly what he meant. My safety was irrelevant, my attempt at freedom a joke. But Evelyn's was contingent upon my immediate compliance and return. I turned slowly, my hands clenched inside the leather straps of my bag until they hurt, and looked at Rafael. He just waited, his expression neutral, patient, like he was waiting for a bus. I understood then that my escape wasn't just thwarted, it was meaningless, pointless. Dante didn't need guards on the doors. He had information on the things I loved most, the only things that anchored me to a life outside his orbit. I walked back out of the alley, my pace now slow and deliberate, all the energy drained out of me, and got into the back of the car, slamming the door a little harder than necessary. A tiny, pathetic act of rebellion that felt utterly wasted even as I did it. I didn't look at Rafael again. I just stared straight ahead, watching the city lights blur into streaks of color, feeling the cage tighten around me, realizing I wasn't just his designer. I was his possession, and he knew everything about my life. The fear, the scarcity, the younger sister I cherished and protected above all else, the knowledge of which was his ultimate cruel control. The next day, Dante brought it up in his office, which was a vast, minimalist space overlooking the entire bay, a view that felt like a deliberate reminder of his dominion over everything I could see and everything I was trying to escape to. I was standing near the window trying to look at the sunset, instead of him focusing on the distant hazy line where the water met the sky, when he finally addressed my failed escape with a quiet certainty that made the blood run cold. "You were running from a ghost, Amelia," he said, and I flinched because that's exactly what I'd been doing. I'd been running from the ghost of my ex, from the memory of that suffocating control, and the feeling of constantly walking on glass only to run straight into Dante's far more elegant, far more lethal grip. He told me then, without any fanfare, that he hadn't just run into me at the club that fateful night. I knew who you were, Amelia Hart. He confessed, and the casualness of his tone made the revelation twice as heavy. A cold, hard stone dropped into my stomach. I knew about the apartment you shared with Evelyn, the tuition payments, the way you doubled over your utility bills at the kitchen table trying to make the numbers work when they simply refused to add up. I knew what he did to you too, the psychological toll, the way he broke your spirit piece by piece, and the sheer desperation that brought you to the brink of recklessness. You walked into the Obsidian because I made sure that club was the only place you thought you could find the kind of temporary recklessness you were looking for, a brief, anonymous escape. He rose, walking around his desk and leaning against the front of it, closer than I was comfortable with, but not close enough to touch, maintaining a precise, controlling distance. That night wasn't fate, not in the simple, random way you mean it. It was orchestrated. But the reason it was orchestrated, Amelia, that part is fate. It's the part you can't run from because it was written long before you met me. He explained then, his voice dropping to a low, intense register, filling the quiet space between us with a terrifying sincerity that I was supposed to be his destined one, the unexpected resolution to his past. Not because of a silly one-night stand, but because of his late wife, Isabella. He told me that his wife, before she died in what he had always believed was a tragic car accident, had mentioned a name, Amelia Hart. He had spent months, maybe a year, having his people search for any Amelia Hart who fit a vague description, believing his wife, who had a strangely mystical side and a belief in numerology, was leaving him a sign, a guide, or maybe even a warning from beyond the grave. He looked at me, then his dark eyes intense. I stood there, rooted to the spot, listening to this powerful man talk about destiny and obsession, feeling the walls of my reality warp and buckle the familiar ground beneath my feet, turning soft and treacherous. I wasn't just a convenient conquest. I was a piece in his much larger, much darker and deeply psychological puzzle, a living echo of a woman he had lost to what he now suspected was a vicious treachery. He told me he hadn't known why he needed to find me, only that his wife's cryptic message had compelled him, turning his pursuit of me from a simple seduction into a mission of destiny. The pressure intensified as the months rolled on, the weight of his obsession and the scrutiny of his world pressing down on me. I was trapped in this impossible duality, professionally respected as the lead designer, the woman who was reorganizing his empire, yet personally scorned as the devil's woman, the temporary distraction. The Mafia world, the one I had tried to ignore, became a silent, judgmental audience to my every interaction with Dante. They saw my cheap blazer replaced by a tailored dress he'd commissioned, my nervous energy replaced by a rigid, controlled posture, and they judged me for the speed of my ascent, for the audacity of my presence. I could hear the whispers even when they thought they were too far away, hiding behind the clinking of ice and the loud drone of conversation. She's only here because she looks like his dead wife. Look at the hair, the stillness. He can't move on, so he bought a replacement. She'll be gone by winter. They didn't see me. They saw a ghost he was desperately trying to bring back to life, and I became resentful of Isabella for casting this long, dark shadow over my hard-won success. The humiliation peaked at a sprawling, opulent gala, held in a ballroom that must have cost a fortune to rent, a place dripping with old-world wealth and new-world vice. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume cigars and cold danger, the kind of air that tastes like betrayal. I was wearing a dress Dante had insisted on, one of a deep, striking emerald green that made my eyes look brighter, but also made me feel like I was wearing a costume, a gaudy, ill-fitting symbol of his possession. I felt like a cheap imitation of a woman who truly belonged there, an outsider pretending to navigate the treacherous social currents. As I tried to navigate the sea of black ties and diamond necklaces, clinging to a glass of sparkling water, like it was a life raft, keeping my expression politely neutral, I was cornered near a massive ice sculpture of a snarling lion, by a woman everyone referred to as the queenpin of the East Coast operation, a figure named Clarissa. She was stunning in a predatory way, with eyes that saw everything, and a smile that promised ruin without a single word. Clarissa didn't waste any time on pleasantries. Her movements were sharp, precise, like a striking snake. She leaned in close, her voice a low, throaty purr that only I could hear above the soft orchestra music, making her words feel intimate and utterly menacing. "You're fragile little designer. You break easily. You talk about fabrics and budgets, not blood and silence. We all know you're nothing but a cheap ghost in her shadow." She sneered, her eyes raking over my dress, finding every single flaw in my posture and background, stripping away my confidence piece by piece. "He's projecting his grief onto you, trying to replace the irreplaceable. And ghosts always disappear, don't they? When he realizes you're just a low-class girl with an eye for color, and not the woman he lost, the fall will be spectacular, Amelia. Just make sure you don't take anything valuable with you when you finally hit the pavement." Her words weren't aimed at hurting my feelings. They were calculated to break my resolve and deliver a clear, specific warning of my expiration date. I felt that familiar cold knot tightening in my stomach, the one I used to get around my ex when he was setting a trap, the one that meant I had to be perfectly still and perfectly silent to survive. Later that evening, even Raphael, the man who seemed incapable of emotion and whose face was always as blank as a stone wall, approached me with a rare flicker of something like concern, or perhaps grim exhaustion in his eyes. He found me standing alone on a secluded balcony, looking out over the glittering, uncaring city, trying to breathe past the tightness in my chest. "You're playing a dangerous game, Amelia," he murmured, his voice flat but carrying a strange, heavy weight, like a warning carved in granite. "Loving the boss is a death sentence. His first wife, she taught him that betrayal is inevitable, that loyalty is a myth, and that anyone he allows close is a potential target or a potential mole. His possession of you isn't love in the way you understand it. It's a desperate need for control, a way to try and rewrite his own tragic ending. You need to understand the longer you stay, the more you risk becoming a casualty of his past, a victim of his paranoia. You wear his mark, yes, but in this world that mark doesn't offer protection. It attracts every enemy he's ever made, like a lighthouse guiding a ship to the rocks." His honesty, unexpected and brutal, stung more than Clarissa's malice because it came from a place of cold, informed truth. I tried to leave again the very next week, an attempt born less of hope and more of sheer desperation to protect Evelyn from the spiraling danger. I packed a small, practical suitcase, bought a one-way train ticket to a city 4 states away, and wrote a meticulous coded letter to Evelyn, instructing her to call a number I'd memorized, a contact I had used in my old life. If I didn't call her back in 72 hours, an emergency protocol I hoped she'd never need to execute. I thought I was being smarter this time, waiting until Dante was supposedly on a short trip overseas to handle a dispute in Eastern Europe, hoping the physical distance would buy me a few hours of head start. I was halfway to the station, sitting in a cheap taxi I'd paid for in cash, watching the meter tick upward with agonizing slowness, when my burner phone vibrated with a single sharp sound. It was a text message, simply a picture of my train ticket confirmation, circled in glaring red marker, followed by a single line of text: "Don't. The journey is already too long." It was from Dante. The casual confidence, the speed, the absolute certainty of his reach hit me like a wall. I knew I couldn't run anymore. My freedom was a complete illusion. I told the cab driver to turn around, my voice flat with defeat. When he returned looking tired but radiating a renewed icy strength, I confronted him, the anger finally overcoming the fear and the exhaustion. I threw the phone onto his massive desk and demanded to know why he was doing this, why he felt the need to cage me when I had never asked for anything but a job and a fair wage, when I had already spent years running from a man who wanted to control my every breath. He walked toward me then, not with anger, but with a terrifying, absolute calm, his hands deep in his pockets, his posture relaxed, but deadly. He didn't raise his voice, didn't touch me, but his presence filled the room until there was no space left for me to breathe or to think. "Too late," he said, his voice low and firm, a sound of finality. "You already wear my mark, Amelia. You wear the emerald dress, you sit in my boardrooms, you've tasted the kind of life I can offer, and you've felt the security of my protection whether you asked for it or not. I don't need to use violence to keep you here. I need only to remove my protection. You know what awaits you outside in the life you left behind, the scarcity, the crushing utility bills, the ghost of the man who still thinks he owns your time. My control is psychological, Amelia, and it is absolute. You are safe only as long as you are mine, and I will not permit you to put yourself or Evelyn back in the path of lesser predators." It was that last sentence, the quiet, devastating acknowledgement, that he knew exactly how to twist the knife that broke me down to quiet acceptance, ending the war I was fighting against him. The freedom I thought I had found that one night, the brief, reckless moment of self-indulgence, had become the heaviest, most complicated chain I'd ever worn. I stopped trying to escape, and instead I immersed myself in the work with a frenetic, almost manic energy, letting the design plans, the fabric textures, and the architectural drawings become my fortress, a place he couldn't entirely touch or control. I spent my days designing a world that was elegant, structured, and perfectly ordered, precisely because my own world had become so chaotic and contained, using the straight lines of architecture to try and straighten the confusing lines of my life. But even as I worked, a tiny hard kernel of rebellion remained in my heart, a desperate, silent need to find the key to this gilded cage he'd constructed around me, a key that had to be the truth. The opportunity came one rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was researching historical records for the building's original architecture. Dante was a stickler for historical accuracy in his projects, believing the past held the secrets to controlling the future, when I stumbled across a small private library, tucked away behind a service elevator on the top floor, a room that wasn't on the current blueprints he'd given me. It was dusty and dark, a sanctuary of forgotten things, smelling faintly of old paper and leather. And there, tucked behind a heavy volume of Italian poetry, a first edition of Petrarch founded a small leather-bound journal clearly belonging to Dante's late wife, Isabella. My heart started to hammer instantly, a frantic loud noise in the silence of the room, and I knew I was doing something dangerous, something that could shatter everything and expose me to a new kind of terror. But I needed to know the truth behind the ghost I was supposed to be, the real reason I was here, a reason deeper than Dante's manipulative obsession. I took the journal back to my apartment that night, hiding it deep inside my portfolio, underneath several heavy design drafts. That night, under the weak glow of my living room lamp, with Evelyn thankfully asleep, I read it. Isabella's handwriting was elegant, swirling, and surprisingly sad, filled with a melancholy that spoke of a deep dissatisfaction despite her wealth. She wrote about Dante's intensity, his consuming love, which felt like a beautiful form of imprisonment, and then slowly about her growing fear. She wrote about feeling suffocated, about sensing betrayal around her, not from Dante, but from within his closest circle, from the people who smiled at her at dinner parties. She detailed secret meetings, hushed phone calls, and the feeling that someone was moving the pieces of her life without her knowledge. And then there, on a brittle, tear-stained page near the end, was my name. Not just Amelia, but Amelia Hart. The writing was shaky, rushed like it had been scrawled in a panic, the final words a desperate testament. The entry read, "If I disappear, if I don't make it out, find Amelia Hart, she'll understand. She saw it. She knows the truth." My mind flashed back to years ago, when I was struggling just after the breakup, living in a tiny, terrible apartment in the warehouse district, working 2 shifts at a diner just to keep the lights on. I remembered a sudden, sharp, terrible scream late one night in the rain, the distinctive roar of a powerful engine, a silver car speeding away without headlights, and the sight of a woman crumpled against a brick wall in a pool of water, her green silk scarf draped across the wet pavement like a fallen banner. I had been terrified and called the police anonymously from a payphone before running away, too scared of being involved in anything that might draw attention to my own fragile situation, to stay and wait for the authorities. The woman had been beautiful, impossibly elegant, and wearing a striking emerald green dress, a dress of that specific jewel-toned shade that Dante had recently insisted I wear. I hadn't known it was Dante's wife then. I just knew it was tragedy. I realized with a nauseating jolt that I hadn't just seen an accident. I had witnessed the aftermath of her murder, and my destiny with Dante wasn't based on a vague prophecy or a resemblance to a deceased wife, but on a shared buried past I didn't even know I possessed, the universe having dragged me back to the scene of a crime I thought I'd escaped. I didn't sleep that night, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with horrifying precision. I walked into Dante's office the next morning with the journal clutched in my hands, placing it on his desk, not with defiance but with a terrible shaking certainty my quiet strength now amplified by the weight of the truth. The real ghost, Dante, I whispered, my voice low and steady, is you. You've been haunted by a lie. This wasn't an accident. It was a carefully executed betrayal. He didn't even look at the book at first. He just looked at me, seeing the absolute conviction in my eyes, something that must have cut through his carefully constructed grief and paranoia. He picked up the journal slowly, his hands, which were usually so steady, trembling just slightly, a tiny crack in his monumental control. As he read the final frantic entries, his face, usually so controlled, went utterly white, the color draining away until he looked like marble, the truth hitting him with the force of a physical impact. The revelation that his wife was betrayed from within, that Silas Kane, his old rival, a man who had always been too close and too charming, was somehow involved, and that my brief, terrifying memory held the key, shook him to the core. His foundation of absolute control cracked, replaced by a devastating, visible fury and despair. He was devastated not by the confirmation of her death, but by the confirmation of his own blindness, the years he had spent mourning a tragic accident, when he should have been hunting a killer and a thief. He sent me away, not in anger, but in a sudden, urgent need for solitude, an overwhelming need to absorb the truth that had just rewritten his entire history and exposed his life as a colossal lie. But in the days that followed, the shift in our dynamic was undeniable. He no longer looked at me as a replacement ghost or a temporary mistress, but as the living, breathing key to his salvation, a silent, knowing witness to the secret of his life. A woman who had, by accident and then by choice, forced him to look at the unforgiving reality. This new, raw connection, however, only fueled the paranoia and resentment in his circle. Raphael, his ever-loyal shadow, couldn't handle it, viewing my sudden elevation from mistress designer to key witness as an unbelievable danger. He confronted Dante not in a whisper, but in the middle of a high-stakes strategic planning session, where I was presenting the final detailed schematics for the executive floors, pointing out critical security choke points. She's too perfect, boss. She appeared too easily, and she found this journal too conveniently, exactly when you were losing the legal battle against Silas. Raphael challenged, his voice tight with suspicion and professional fear. She's a spy. She has to be, or a desperate opportunist. You let her in too close. You let your grief cloud your judgment, and her quiet eyes charm you into believing a conspiracy theory she orchestrated. Dante didn't answer Raphael directly. He just dismissed the meeting with a sharp nod. But the seed of doubt had been sown deeply and viciously, and I saw it flicker in the depths of his dark eyes, a chilling echo of Clarissa's earlier warning, the inability of a paranoid man to ever fully trust a woman. Dante grew distant, cold, his faith in me cracking under the overwhelming weight of his own paranoia and the centuries-old rules of his world. He started leaving me alone in the headquarters for hours, ignoring my calls, forcing me to rely on Raphael for communication. And when he did speak to me, his voice was clipped, asking pointed, almost interrogatory questions about my past life, about Evelyn's sudden move to the city, about everything I had held private, trying to find a lie, any lie to justify the doubt. I was interrogated, confined to the penthouse under the guise of protection, every move I made monitored by the security team. It was the deepest humiliation to be treated not as a partner in truth, but as a primary suspect, a weapon waiting to misfire and ruin his empire. I felt the slow, agonizing return of the familiar suffocation I thought I had escaped years ago, the feeling of walking on eggshells, knowing one wrong word could bring the ceiling down on my head. The situation exploded with a sudden, devastating violence when Evelyn was kidnapped. I was staring at the surveillance monitor in the penthouse library, watching the static shot of the front gate, utterly bored and despairing, when Dante's burner phone, the secure one he rarely used, rang. It was Silas Kane, his voice distorted by a cheap scrambler, but instantly recognizable, dripping with smug cruelty and triumphant malice. Silas's message was simple. Give me the files your little designer found. Dante, the ones that connect me to Isabella, or your pet sister gets an education in the realities of your world. I hear she likes to draw. I'll send you her sketchbook page by bloody page. Silas was not only Dante's rival and the murderer of his wife, he was also, as the journal revealed, the late wife's former lover, adding a new vicious layer to the betrayal. And the realization that he was now targeting Evelyn for my actions was a searing pain. The shock was instantaneous, but before I could speak, before I could plead, Dante turned to me, his face a mask of cold, devastating fury, the years of mistrust and betrayal exploding out of him in one terrible moment, erasing all the intimacy we had shared. "You," he hissed, pointing an accusing finger at me, the years of pain and mistrust exploding out of him in one terrible moment, the sight of his face a cold horror. "You led him to her. You brought my enemy a target. You were the distraction, weren't you? The perfect grieving fool who came to me with a convenient truth to get close. What was the price, Amelia? What did Silas promise you?" He wouldn't listen to me. Wouldn't let me explain the fear, the terror in my own heart, the sheer audacity of his accusation. In that moment, blinded by betrayal and the immediate terrifying threat to Evelyn, he believed I had done this, that I was playing him, and that the journal was a manufactured weapon. He didn't hurt me himself. He didn't even touch me. He didn't need to. He just turned to his men, who stood wide-eyed and stunned by the boss's sudden devastating turn, and ordered them to teach her a lesson, his voice heavy with crushing authority and finality. The lesson, I knew instantly, wouldn't be physical, but it would ensure I was completely broken, psychologically, utterly confined, and silenced, forever, locked away from the outside world, my sister, and the ability to fight back. But Dante didn't know the lessons I had already learned in my life, the quiet resilience I had built through years of being invisible and underestimated. While his men were securing the penthouse, still reeling from the unexpected order, fumbling with the security codes and the panic, I was already moving. I didn't panic. I went cold-focused, letting the rage burn away the fear. I'd spent months designing the high-tech, customized security hub for this building, arguing with his engineers over every millimeter of wiring, and I knew every single flaw, every backdoor, every system override I had insisted upon for redundancy. I slipped away during the confusion, while the men were arguing over which route to take to the ground floor, using a service stairwell. Only the maintenance crew and I knew about feeling the smooth, cold plaster wall under my fingers as I went. I didn't run. I moved with the precision of someone who knew exactly where they were going and exactly what needed to be done, treating the escape as a high-stakes, real-time renovation project. I found the temporary security hub in the basement, a dark, small room tucked behind the climate control unit. The same unit I had argued needed a redesign 6 weeks prior, knowing its current position was vulnerable. The door was a steel plate locked with a multi-factor digital cipher, but the system was the one I had specified. I didn't need to pick the lock. I used the override code I had intentionally left in the system's back end during the final integration test, a subtle 4-digit sequence I had buried inside a maintenance log, a small, subtle act of self-preservation I had buried months ago, never thinking I would need it for myself. Once inside the small room, hummed with the power of the server bank, I went straight to the surveillance console, not to disable it, but to access the comprehensive satellite surveillance system that Dante's company used for international asset tracking. The surveillance system wasn't just on the buildings. It was a sprawling, invisible net cast over half the continent, and I knew exactly how to use its blind spots and its incredible resolution to my advantage. I found Evelyn almost instantly, my fingers flying over the console, the knowledge of the system flowing through me like a second language. Silas hadn't taken her far, just to an abandoned industrial site on the very edge of the city limits, a place he thought was secure but was actually directly underneath an old fixed-position satellite Dante used for monitoring a rival's defunct shipping routes. The image on the screen was grainy but clear enough to see the terror in Evelyn's face. I didn't waste a second calling Dante. I knew he wouldn't trust me, and there wasn't time for a debate. I scribbled down the address, secured the only weapon I could find in the mechanical room, a heavy, rusty length of pipe from a discarded HVAC unit balanced perfectly for a solid swing, and walked out. The journey was a blur of taxis, back roads, and pure, terrifying adrenaline, but I didn't hesitate. I was driven by a ferocity I didn't know I possessed, the quiet, unassuming woman from the humble background suddenly moving like a force of nature, driven by the simple, absolute need to protect the one person in the world who mattered more than my own survival, or Dante's misplaced trust. I arrived at the sprawling, dilapidated warehouse, slipping in through a gap in a broken fence, the industrial landscape dark cold and echoing with emptiness. I found Evelyn tied to a metal chair in the center of the vast, echoing space, looking small and pale, but thankfully unharmed. Silas was there talking into a satellite phone, completely preoccupied with his negotiations with Dante, his back to me basking in the arrogance of his temporary victory. He looked up when I entered, his eyes widening in genuine surprise, a look that told me I was the last person he ever expected to walk through that door, a flaw in his meticulously planned cruelty. I didn't give him a chance to react, to shout, or to reach for his weapon. I swung the heavy pipe not in anger, but with grim, precise purpose, using the weight to generate maximum force, hitting the satellite phone out of his hand and knocking him back against a stack of empty crates with a terrible echoing clang. While he was reeling, cursing, and reaching frantically for the small pistol tucked into his waistband, I worked fast, moving on instinct. I untied Evelyn, shoved her out the broken fence, telling her to run and hide in the abandoned loading bay until I called, forcing her to safety with a panicked urgency. Then I went back for the real prize, the evidence that would end the war. Hidden in a locked briefcase near Silas's feet were the true files, the originals. Silas's meticulous ledger, the detailed records of the financial transactions that proved he had orchestrated Isabella's death and stolen millions from Dante's rival businesses, proving he was the double-crossing viper Dante had invited into his home. I grabbed the briefcase, my hand trembling only slightly now, the exhaustion of the fight giving way to a cold focus, and ran back out, dodging the single terrified guard who finally came running into the space, alerted by the noise. I had rescued my sister, but I had also secured the absolute, undeniable proof that would either save me or condemn me to death. I stood before Dante in his office a few hours later, after dropping Evelyn off at a safe location, still covered in the dust and grime of the warehouse, my hair a mess, my knees skinned from climbing the fence, the pipe mark still visible on my face. The sun was coming up, painting the vast cityscape in shades of bruised purple and cold gray, a new dawn over a shattered empire. Dante was there alone, sitting behind his desk, his face etched with exhaustion and confusion, the weight of the kidnapping and the betrayal having momentarily stripped him of his usual icy control. I didn't speak a word. I simply walked to his desk, dropped the heavy briefcase on the polished wood with a loud, resounding thud that shattered the silence, and opened it. I watched as the contents, the meticulous ledgers, the coded communication transcripts, the undeniable proof of Silas's treachery, spilled out onto his spotless surface, evidence of a betrayal that had haunted him for years. "You wanted truth," I said, my voice hoarse, raw from the smoke, but steadier than I had expected, every word a stone of fact. I didn't shout. I didn't gloat. I didn't even beg for his forgiveness or trust. I just stated the fact, the reality of what I had done, the price I had just paid for his freedom and my sister's safety. I brought it back from hell, Dante. You let your men teach me a lesson while your enemy held my sister, and your salvation was in his hands. I didn't wait for you to trust me. I went and got the truth myself. I just stood there, my hand resting on the dirty briefcase, waiting for his judgment, my posture defiant but exhausted. For the first time since I had met him, the devil in a suit was silent, truly and completely shaken by my defiance and the irrefutable evidence I had laid before him. He looked at the files, the undeniable proof of his failure, then at me, seeing the steel in my eyes, the absolute absence of fear or artifice, recognizing the quiet fire he had tried to extinguish. A long, slow moment passed, a moment that felt like the earth had stopped spinning, and then he spoke, his voice barely a rasp, a broken whisper of his usual authority. He didn't say, "I'm sorry," or "I was wrong." He just gave an order, a final, unchallengeable decree. "Raphael!" he called out, and Raphael, who must have been lurking just outside the door, entered instantly, his face a perfect mask of dread and suspicion, which instantly evaporated when he saw the contents of the briefcase. "No one touches her," Dante commanded, his voice regaining its authority, but with a new strange reverence underlying the command, a quiet awe. "She is mine. She is mine, Raphael, in a way I've never known, not as a possession, but as a force. Find Silas, and make sure every single one of those files is secured and authenticated. then call the council and inform them the price of my blindness has been paid by the one I doubted most. The truth should have set me free, or at least allowed a moment of peace, but in this world truth only raises the stakes and makes the enemy more desperate. Silas Kane, cornered and desperate, stripped of his network. His power and his freedom unleashed his final, most poisonous act. He couldn't kill me, not yet, but he could ruin me in the eyes of the man I had risked everything for, the man whose trust I finally possessed. He released a fake video, a highly doctored, sophisticated piece of visual fabrication using deepfake technology, showing me meeting with him in a dimly lit cafe, my posture intimate, my smile complicit, implying a deep, intimate collaboration and a willing betrayal that spanned months. The video was timed to hit the network just hours after Dante had publicly declared my place at his side, right after the council had officially begun reviewing the Silas files, a perfectly timed poison pill. The Mafia network, starved for drama and fueled by old suspicion of outsiders and women, ate it up with ravenous speed. The whispers turned into shouts. He's been betrayed again. The quiet little designer was a deep mole using his dead wife's journal to get close and steal his empire. Dante, already emotionally threadbare from the previous weeks, saw the video, and the dam of his paranoia finally burst, washing away all his newfound conviction. He didn't ask me if it was true. He didn't wait for an explanation, didn't let Raphael or me debunk the clear digital fabrication. The memory of his late wife's actual betrayal, combined with the image of me laughing across a table from the man who had murdered her, was too much for his fractured mind to bear. The ice in his eyes returned colder and sharper than ever before, freezing the love and trust I thought we had finally built. He stripped me of all status publicly, brutally, with the speed of a falling knife. I was no longer his designer, no longer his witness, no longer his anything. He didn't banish me from the city. He did something worse, something crueler. He banished me from his sight, from his protection, from his life, but kept me confined to a small, isolated luxury property he owned miles outside the city. A beautiful but suffocating prison, where I couldn't communicate with Evelyn or the outside world, a golden cage with a broken lock. The final blow came when he looked at me, his eyes full of a devastating mix of pain and fury, the raw feeling of betrayal overwhelming him, and simply said, "Get out of my sight. I bought you safety and you chose his shadow. I will never let you betray me again, but I will no longer look at you." I didn't argue. I just stood there, taking the full force of his rejection, feeling the familiar cold sting of being underestimated and wrongly judged one last time. I walked out, not with a suitcase this time, but with nothing but the clothes on my back, leaving the keys to the gilded prison on the mahogany table. I wasn't just walking away from him. I was walking away from the entire lie of safety he had created, the conditional peace. I let the icy rain soak me through as I walked down the deserted long drive, washing away the remnants of the tailored dress and the pretense of the life I'd lived. Standing on the curb of the lonely highway, soaked to the bone, watching his mansion disappear into the gray, misty distance, I made a silent vow, a steady, unbreakable promise to myself that settled deep into my bones. If your love is a cage, Dante Moretti, I'll break it, and I'll burn the entire structure down to the foundations. And when I come back, it won't be as your possession or your victim. It will be as your equal or your destroyer. I didn't run to the police. I ran to the only people who would listen to a disgruntled designer with a vendetta against Dante, his old enemies, the rival families and rogue elements Silas had courted. I allied myself with them, not to join them, but to destroy Silas from within their ranks, using them as a temporary ladder. It was a calculated risk, a move so reckless it felt like pure, glorious freedom, the final embrace of the danger I had spent my life avoiding. I used the intimate knowledge I had of Dante's network, the surveillance blind spots, the communication encryption flaws, the political fault lines revealed during my design process, to earn my way in offering them weaknesses they never knew existed. I told them only half-truths enough to gain leverage enough to make Silas look weak and compromised to his new allies. I positioned myself as a disgruntled asset, a former favorite who held the keys to Dante's current vulnerabilities, the perfect, overlooked insider seeking revenge. I didn't care about their power games. I only cared about getting close enough to Silas, establishing his patterns, and finally bringing him down for good. The final confrontation happened at an old dockside warehouse, a classic shadowy scene of a massive arms exchange that I had, through careful misdirection and planting false intel, ensured Dante's people would crash. I was there standing with Silas and two of his most loyal thugs pretending to monitor the exchange, my heart a cold stone in my chest, when Dante and his men, led by Raphael, burst through the steel doors with devastating organized force. Chaos erupted instantly, the roar of gunshots, the shouting of terrified men, the terrifying echo of metal against metal. I didn't move. I stayed right where I was standing next to Silas, keeping my hands visible, watching Dante's expression go from rage at the situation to pure devastating shock when he saw me standing there, seemingly on Silas's side, alive and complicit. Silas grabbed my arm, trying to use me as a shield, his grip tight with panic. But I pulled away hard, stepping back into the light of a broken overhead lamp, casting my figure in a halo of dirty yellow light. "You lost your wife because you trusted the wrong person." Dante, I called out across the vast, echoing space, the sound of my voice cutting through the mayhem like a whip crack. My words weren't a plea. They were a hard, simple statement of fact, the kind of truth that demands immediate, absolute attention. This time, you either trust me now with absolutely no proof but my history, or you lose everything, including the proof I'm about to put on the Council's main server, the evidence that will take down all of you. I didn't look at Dante for his answer, maintaining eye contact with Silas. I pulled out a small encrypted thumb drive, one I had prepared months ago, preloaded with copies of the ledgers, and plugged it into the laptop Silas had been using to track the shipment. Dante saw the drive. He saw the raw, uncompromising steel in my eyes, and he saw the calculated risk I was taking for the second time. For the first time, he chose trust without evidence. He ordered his men to hold fire, and he stepped out from behind the cover of a massive container, walking slowly toward me, completely exposed to the crossfire. Silas, sensing the catastrophic shift, tried to raise his small remaining gun, but Raphael, ever watchful, shot the weapon out of his hand, forcing him to his knees with a cry of pain. I finished the upload, the small green light on the drive, flickering once, confirming the transmission of the original authenticated ledgers, and a live feed of Silas's current compromised position to the entire council. I pulled the drive out, and then looked directly at Dante, our eyes locking over the chaos. I hadn't come back for his love. I had come back for his trust, demanding it with proof and courage, not surrender, and the demand was answered. The silence that followed was total, broken only by the distant wail of sirens approaching the docks. Dante walked the rest of the distance to me, stopping only when he was close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off him, the scent of gunpowder mixing with his familiar, expensive cologne. He didn't say a word. He just reached out his hand, resting gently on my cheek, his thumb brushing away a stray smear of dirt and blood. Then he pulled me into a fierce, absolute embrace right there in the crossfire before his men, before the captured Silas, before the entire world he commanded. He held me tightly, a shudder running through his frame, a genuine raw emotion I had never seen him allow before. And then he faced the crowd of his own men and the incoming council security team, his voice ringing with a conviction that left no room for doubt or argument. "She's not my curse," Dante declared, the words echoing off the steel beams of the warehouse. "She's my salvation. She brought the truth back from the fire twice. She is mine, and I will be hers, and anyone who touches her will answer to me." I thought the war was finally over then, that the truth had won the final battle. But Silas Kane, stripped of his network, his power and his freedom, chose absolute total vengeance over survival. He didn't go quietly. He went with a deafening roar. A week later, during a formal, carefully orchestrated meeting Dante was holding with the council at his sprawling estate, the very estate I had spent months redesigning the symbol of his power, Silas detonated a series of charges he had planted years earlier, back when he had first started planning his insidious coup. The explosion was massive, a roaring, consuming fire that engulfed the main house in seconds, a cruel, poetic irony for the man obsessed with control and order, turning his empire into a bonfire. I was inside the library pulling final certified files for the meeting when the windows shattered and the world turned into a hurricane of smoke, noise, and fire. The force of the blast threw me violently against a massive marble column, knocking the air out of my lungs and leaving me temporarily paralyzed. I remember the sound of tearing wood, the smell of burning velvet and expensive paper, and the terrible suffocating heat that instantly licked at my skin. I couldn't move, not for a minute, lying there in the suffocating darkness, listening to the screams and the terrible, relentless crackle of the flames growing closer, feeling the heat intensify with every terrible second. Dante, outside with the rest of the council, saw the explosion instantly, the sight of his home and my presence within it triggering a primal, devastating panic. He didn't wait for his men. He didn't care about the gunfire that broke out between the council's security and Silas's last remaining desperate crew. He ran straight toward the flames, ignoring the frantic calls of Raphael, ignoring the logic that dictated survival, becoming a figure consumed by a desperate, terrifying love. He burst through the smoke, fighting his way into the inferno, looking for me, yelling my name. His face black with soot, his expensive suit tearing until his men finally dragged him back out, badly burned and screaming, just moments before the roof of the library collapsed into a shower of sparks and ruin. He thought I was dead. I know because Raphael told me later, his voice heavy with the grief of having watched his boss break completely. Dante, believing I was consumed by the fire he couldn't reach, unleashed a hell the city hadn't seen in decades. The man who was always cold, controlled, and calculating became a force of pure destructive grief, his vengeance absolute and terrifying. He wiped out Silas's entire remaining network in a brutal, systematic rampage that lasted 3 days, fueled only by the belief that the one true thing he had ever found had been taken from him by the ghost of his past, a tragedy he couldn't prevent. Raphael, his eyes hollowed out by the carnage, looked at his boss at the end of it all and murmured, "You've become the devil again, Dante, but this time you've lost your soul completely." When the silence finally fell over the city, when the last of Silas's people had been purged, Dante didn't celebrate. He just collapsed, broken and silent, lost in the ruin of the truth and the tragedy that had consumed us both, utterly defeated by the price of his obsession. But I didn't die. I was pulled out of the library's rubble not by Dante's men, but by a small independent group, a local street gang that Dante had once quietly helped with a territory dispute years ago, and who happened to be nearby. They didn't know who I was, only that I was the woman the boss was desperately searching for, and they slipped me out of the chaos before the authorities or his security could find me. The blast, however, had been cruel. I woke up in a sterile room in a dingy clinic with a splitting headache and a complete, terrifying blankness where my life should have been. The name Amelia Hart meant nothing. Dante Moretti meant nothing. The only thing that remained was a strange, deep physical ache that felt like profound loss and an instinctual understanding of design and color, a quiet need to organize the chaos into something beautiful. The gang, loyal to the old favor Dante had done them, kept me hidden, giving me a new simple identity. And I started rebuilding my life with the only thing I had left, my art. I took small commissions, painting, drawing, anything that let me channel the strange electric energy that seemed to reside just below the surface of my memory, the undefined trauma. I painted faces that looked intensely lonely, portraits of a dark-haired man whose expression I couldn't place but whose haunted gaze I instinctively knew how to capture. A year passed, a quiet, simple year, where I felt like a leaf that had simply floated onto a different shore, completely cut off from my past. I was an artist now, living simply, completely unaware of the gilded cage, the Mafia wars, or the man whose heart had broken in the fire, existing in a peaceful, yet unsettling void. Then at a quiet, unpretentious art auction, I had been convinced to attend a small local event showcasing new artists. I saw him. I saw a man impossibly elegant walking through the crowd, not with the arrogance of power, but with a deep, haunting loneliness that felt palpable even from across the room, the same loneliness I had unconsciously poured into my canvas. He stopped in front of one of my paintings, a piece I had signed with my old initials A.H., a painting I hadn't realized was a self-portrait of him until that very moment. It captured his own haunted gaze, his specific, unique shade of dark, searching eyes, the face of a man who had lost everything and was still looking for it in every shadow, every quiet corner. I watched him turn his eyes, snapping to the signature, tracking the gallery owner, asking sharp, urgent questions. His eyes already narrowed with recognition. The hunter's instinct immediately re-engaged, focused solely on the initials. I didn't run. I couldn't. The moment he looked at my painting, the colors I had mixed, the composition I had fought for, the fragile walls of my amnesia shattered completely. The memories flooded back, not in a rush, but in a slow, overwhelming wave of heartbreak, fire, and absolute devastating love. I remembered the cold, the control, the fear, and the final beautiful acceptance. I remembered his embrace, his words, and his devastation in the face of the fire. He tracked the painting back to my humble studio the very next day, a small paint-splattered space above a dry cleaner. I heard the car pull up, a familiar silent engine, the sound of immense costly power barely contained. I heard the quiet click of the lock, being bypassed, the same efficient sound of the security system I had designed. I turned away from my easel, paintbrush in hand, and saw him standing there in the doorway, older, sharper, but with that same terrible, consuming light in his eyes, a desperate hope replacing the cold fury. He didn't need to ask who I was. He knew. And I knew. It was never a one-night affair. I whispered the words, catching in my throat, the truth of our journey settling over us like heavy silk, an acceptance that was both devastating and liberating. It was a lifetime sentence. I spent a year trying to run from a ghost I didn't remember. He spent a year trying to rebuild a world that had been shattered. I thought I had broken free, that the fire had cleansed me of his obsession, but now I know that fire simply fused us, bonding us in a way neither of us can ever truly escape. I look at him now, standing there, the devil in a suit who brought me to hell, and then walked through the flames to find me, and I know that the hardest strength isn't leaving, but deciding to stay, deciding to fight for the future we accidentally built. We were never small, never insignificant, just unseen in a world that only values loud power. We always knew exactly who we were, and now finally the world knows it too. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.